Well, it's finally here. What's finally here? It's finally time to close out season 3. Oh, really? Is that really what it is time for? Yes, it is. The giving season is here, and this is the time of the year when Sports for Beginners season 3 and all of our seasons for Sports for Beginners wrap up. Thank you so much to everyone for checking us out. The Sports for Beginners Season 3 Christmas Party 1 hour season finale starts now. Welcome to Sports for Beginners. This is the show where I cover the Pittsburgh Penguins, Toronto Blue Jays, and take you on a journey through the world of sports. From the fans' perspective, here is your host, Scott McGregor. Let's have some fun. Happy holidays, everyone. We are coming to you live on Monday, December 16th, 2024, with our final Friday program of season number 3. Welcome in to our Christmas Party 1 hour season 3 finale, which begins right now as we are doing it now. I am your host, Scott McGregor. This is scheduled to drop on Friday, December 20th, 2024, which is in a few days from now. Friday, December 20th, 2024. That is when this will drop, within a few days from now. 4 days to be exact. And I could not be more excited to bring it to you, even if I'm riding solo without any guests. But speaking of guests, I decided this year, feeling giving, around the timeline when we would hear voice messages, I've decided we're not only going to hear the voice messages from our contributors in the past, but we're also going to hear one full-length interview that went down, maybe not in season 3, but in previous seasons, in one of the 2 previous seasons. So be sure you stick around for that. We are going to lead this holiday celebration off with a look at our Wrapped as podcasters for creators, Spotify for creators, I should say, formerly known as Anchor.fm and Spotify for podcasters, has brought out our 2024 Wrapped. So let's take a look at how we did this year. This also will follow, I should say, after this, we will follow up with our top 10 episodes for the podcast this year. Voice messages coming before we talk a little sports, and specifically talk about the upcoming action over the holiday season. And of course, I want to let everyone know that we've been asking, not many have contributed, but that's okay. We've been asking the question, what are your favorite holiday traditions? Your favorite holiday music included, your favorite holiday movies, all that jazz. And today, I'm going to continue asking that question on our 1 hour season finale Christmas party edition. For those who were on a video version of one of our last ones when we had Ali, Thomas, and a couple other people in the studio, I thank you all for joining us, even if you weren't with us the entire program. With that said, let's jump to it, shall we? It's time to get into our Creators Wrap 2024 by Spotify. And this year, our top episode was very different. It wasn't the hockey program. When we did a Winter Classic show, but we went from the ice to the baseball field. Let's get started. Fans were really loving sports for beginners in 2024. We took the show to a whole new level this year, gained +9 followers, +9% in followers. Thank you so much for checking us out and following up. A clear favorite for the fans. And the top episode this year was Blue Jays game recap. Blue Jays versus Padres 3-game series recap show. I wonder why. Well, it was streamed 393% more than your average episode, than an average episode, I should say, on the podcast, whether that be a season content or any of the other bonus content, including PWHL recap, which just returned, Bills postgame, which has been ongoing. I should say. And of course, Penguins postgame, also ongoing at the moment. Ever wonder who your audience is? Let's find out where the audience is at. Let's break it down. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you are between the ages of 18 and 24, 8% of you are listening to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are joining us at that age, ages 25 to 29, 25% of you have been listening to the show. Thank you so much. Ages 30 to 34, 8% listening. That's okay. 35 to 44, 25% of you listening to the show there. If you're between the ages of 45 and 54, Thank you so much to the 8% of you who are listening. If you are ages 55 and up, 26% of you. Thank you guys so much for joining us in checking out the podcast. It doesn't really matter how old you guys are, or everyone is, I should say. But listeners by the ages of 55 and up grew the most by 200% in 2024. And where were we in the world? Where in the world have you been? Well, in 2024, Sports for Beginners traveled the globe. It was streamed in 5 countries. Once again, Canada was the top country streaming Sports for Beginners. Our youngest listeners are coming in from India. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Meanwhile, the older listeners are joining us from the neighbor to the Canadian side, from the neighbor to the north. As they would say in the United States, it's the United States. The older listeners are coming from the States, including Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. We got a little bit of a battle of PA going on in that kind of thing there, but more on that over the course of the program. The fans have obviously great taste. Well, what do we mean by great taste? Okay, other than our show, they also love DK Pittsburgh Sports on the Steelers and Penguins and the Pirates. All those Blue Jay fans out there, we know you love Blue Jays talk. Okay, not much could be said about Blue Jays talk. That's coming in at number 2. DK Pittsburgh Sports coming in at number 1. Our neighboring podcast, speaking of neighbors, On the Ice and Behind the Benches coming in at number 3. We Have Ways of Making You Talk coming in at number 4. And at number 5, Total Soccer Show USMNT Champions League EPL and more coming in as our top 5. Our top 5 are DK Pittsburgh Sports, daily podcast on the Steelers, Penguins, and Pirates, followed by Blue Jays Talk at number 2. At number 2, On the Ice and Behind the Benches coming in at number 3. We Have Ways of Making You Talk, a WW2 pod coming in at number 4. I might check that one out. So if you're listening from We Have Ways of Making You Talk, thank you very much for joining us. And at number 5, we've got Total Soccer Show USMNT Champions League EPL and more. If you're joining us from there, thank you so much. only three favorite musics, only three favorite music genres hit our rap this year, beginning with country, jumping in at number one, jump blues at number two, and indie folk coming in at number three. In the audiobook genres, only two audiobook genres our fans are interested in: sci-fi and fantasy, as well as fiction and literature. All right. They didn't just listen. 66% of the audience watched video on Spotify this year. Thank you so much. A lot of our shows haven't been video, they've been audio wise, but that's okay. We'll see what we can do in 2025. And that also coming up in the wrap up, in the finale of the program here. But thank you so much to the 66% of you that have watched video on Spotify this year. And of course, if you are on YouTube, you may want to consider checking out the podcast on the weekly in Sports YouTube channel. There will be a link in the show notes for this game. Not this game. For this episode. To go check it out. And check this show out when it goes live. The creator personality of Sports for Beginners this year, the storyteller. Yeah, I can see this podcast as a storyteller. I can see it. And that is it for our wrap. As Spotify for Creators wraps up saying, thank you for giving people something to talk about. But it's not over yet. Keep the conversation going and share with your fans, like we're doing right now. So once again, the top episode this year, Blue Jays game recap. 3-game series recap show of Padres versus Bills. Sorry, not Bills. Padres versus Blue Jays. Blue Jays game recap in the plans to come back in 2025. And also in the plans to come back in 2025. I want to keep this going as we're going on with it right now into 2025 with Penguins post game. I want to keep the Bills show coming. So those shows coming into 2025's new season, when that begins, those will be back on the air. We have the PWHL back with you, and our recap is based this year on the Minnesota Frost. That will continue until the end of this season. and of course, playoffs in the PWHL. But we want to let everyone else know that I do plan to bring it back in 2025 down the road into 2026. So, with that being said, lots to look forward to. All right. It is time for our first break of the program. When we come back on this 1 hour Sports for Beginners Season 3 Christmas finale, it's time to take a look at our top 10 episodes and how things are looking in the top 10. Plus, you'll hear from contributor and co-host of the program when he's able to make it. Of course, we're now running solo here on Sports for Beginners, but early on we had two co-hosts, I should say, in Thomas McGregor and Ali Musa. You'll hear Ali next on voice messages that he had sent in. You'll hear the two that he sent in regarding October. But after the top 10 episodes following that, we will bring you a little bit from myself in terms of holiday traditions, holiday movies, and holiday music. The party has just gotten started and is not getting to the end anytime soon yet. So if this ends up being a 2-hour program, that's okay. The idea is to keep it at 1 hour, so we'll take a break and come back with top 10 episodes. Ali Musa, his contributions in voice message form. Ali's contributions in voice message form, the top 10 episodes, and to get the holiday content started, I'll provide you with my top 5 Christmas movies that I love watching, and you can get in on the action in our Discord server under the general. I would prefer it under the general for Sports for Beginners is Discord server. I'd prefer it there. Or you can send an email to sportsforbeginners podcast8231@gmail.com. 8231@gmail.com. All right. With that being said, let's take the commercial break. When we come back, Ali, his voice messages, our top 10 episodes, and much more, including my top 5 favorite Christmas movies. Just like I mentioned before we got to this episode, because we don't have the rights to audio for that, we will not play any audio from any movie or any music. But that's okay. Hopefully down the road, we'll get that going for you. again. So with that being said, time for our break. We'll be back in just a moment. Looking for a sports podcast that covers sports weekly as well as gets you set up for the day? Check out Weekly in Sports with me, Scott McGregor. We give some shout-outs of the week to podcasts like this one and those who do them. Discuss the Blue Jays, Bills, Raptors, and more. To learn more, check out the Sports for Beginners Facebook page. Search Sports for Beginners.
Take another look with Gerda Felix and Melanie Taddeo Malo, two powerful women of diverse backgrounds having genuine, unique, and uncomfortable conversations that everyone needs to have. Join Melanie and Gerda for conversations about what is missing from human connections.
Looking for conversations on books and more, as well as tutorials on using your favorite devices and applications? You've come to the right place. Join us weekly on Spicy Techie, where Ali and Sienna provide insightful conversations, as well as useful tips and tricks to help you along on your technological journey. To learn more, tune into the show and like the Spicy Techie Facebook page. Search for Spicy Techie.
Good afternoon, Scott. I'm really enjoying the podcast as per usual. So please keep up the podcast. You've got a great thing going. Keep it going, please. My favorite traditions, I just like to follow sports. On Halloween. I don't typically have I do like chocolate, but I'm not really big on the traditional Halloween side. Please feel free to play this on a future episode. We'll talk soon.
And that's our first voice message from Ali that we received. Actually, that is our second voice message that we received from Ali. That was on November the 3rd. A couple days ago. Actually, it was like a month ago. No, actually, you know what? We're gonna go with a year ago. We're gonna go with a year ago, November 3rd, a year ago. But with that being said, moving right along, before we get to the top 10 episodes, here's Ali's message, the first one we got, which was the feedback for Saturday, October 22nd, 2022. That message you just heard that brought us back in was Ali's thoughts on Halloween. And Ali, I completely understand if you are just someone who likes to follow sports. And as you mentioned, you do like chocolate, but you're not really big on the traditional side of Halloween. So we'll see. I'm going to play that again, probably on Halloween, because I really like listening to it. And some great feedback by Ali as well. Speaking of which, here's what he had to say in the voice message we received on October 22nd, 2022. That was a Saturday. Enjoy.
Hi, Scott. It's Ali here. I just wanted to mention that I'm really enjoying the show and I'm really enjoying what you're putting together. And I wanted to just say I'm enjoying being a part of it as well. So please keep up the phenomenal work. And make sure you guys keep this podcast going because it really suits you well.
And that's Ali ending on a high note with his voice message saying that he just wanted to say, I'm enjoying being a part of it as well. And he said, please keep up the phenomenal work and make sure you guys keep this podcast going because it really suits you well. He's talking to myself and my brother Thomas. Mind you, we have a big day coming up for us after Christmas. As we speak to you right now, we are 24 years old. By the time you listen to this, whether you listen to it in the new year in January or you listen to it just before we hit New Year's Eve, hopefully that's when you do so. Thomas and I will be turning 25 years old in January, and that's going to be a busy day for us on the podcast front. So please bear with us with the bonus content that we have for you. And that's stuff that we're going to get into in a little bit in our stuff going on during the Sports for Beginners hiatus until season 4 begins. And our new era also, speaking of that, in Weekly in Sports will begin in 2025 as it goes from a combined podcast to a podcast of its own. That's what's happening with that in 2025. All right, top 10 episode time. Let's take a look at our top 10. But first off, our all platform overview. We now have 5,694 plays all time. 3 plays per episode. And our audience size has gone to 12 in the all platform overview. In the last 7 days, 25 plays, Over the last 30 days, we have had 89 plays, 229 plays in the last 90 days, and all time, 5,687 plays from August 25th, 2022 to December 16th, 2024, the day that we are recording this right now. On our 2 year of doing the program, top 10 episodes with 36 plays leading off. In the top spot all time, it's the Penguins and the Blues post-game show. Penguins post-game. Penguins and Blues with 36 plays all time. Right behind it is Penguins post-game. Penguins and the Coyotes. Now, just a disclaimer. The Arizona Coyotes right now have been called the Utah Hockey Club, with the Coyotes organization moving to Utah and Salt Lake. So that is what they are known as right now. And they're doing pretty well. They might be falling off the rails a little bit as we go on, but that's okay. So the Penguins and the Blues are the leader with 36 plays all time of Penguin postgame. In second place, we have Penguins postgame Pens and Coyotes, a doubleheader that we did here on Sports for Beginners. And that has 32 plays and is currently in second place. A tie for third place between Jose Bautista Honor News and our very first episode where Ali and Thomas joined me for a couple good minutes in our season 1, episode 1 show. Ali and Thomas were co-hosts at the time, but you can classify them as guests on the show. Whatever works for you. With that being said, both those shows each have 31 plays as we speak to you today. In fourth place, making a case though for the third place spot, which is a two-way tie, it's Penguins postgame, Senators, Penguins, and this is from last year, by the way, just so you know. That's not this year's Penguin postgame show for the Sens and the Pens. That for the Sens and the Pens. That one, among others, still not out yet, including a ton of content that we want to get out. Penguins wise, Bills wise, and Dolphins postgame wise. But more on that a little later. And those will drop by the time you hear this, by the way. Hopefully. A two-way tie for fifth in our top 10 episodes, as we've got the Devils and the Penguins, and episode 3 of season 2 at 29 plays each. In sixth place, Blue Jays game recap regular season preview. And that's another one of those shows we've already done before. Not as of recently. Just in case people are aware. That has 28 plays for sixth place. And a two-way tie for seventh place as we see the Raptors, Lakers, and the Bills post-game show doubleheader version. The Bills and whoever they were facing at that time on the notice for the Bills post-game show. That one and the Raptors game recap program that we did. As I said before on many of the shows I've done as of late, we want to try to bring that one back. If possible, we want to try to bring the Raptor content back if humanly possible. And we want to try to bring that back. And I really hope we can. I really hope we can. But that'll wrap it up here for our top 10 episodes. That was the Bills Dolphins show on Bills post game. All right. So the top 10 episodes are Penguins, Blues, Pens, Coyotes, Jose Bautista, Ali and Thomas on the show. The Jose Bautista news that we had is also up there. Senators and Penguins, Devils, Penguins, Season 2, Episode 3. A Blue Jays game recap, regular season preview. A Raptors game recap, Lakers, Raptors. And Bills post-game show, doubleheader, Bills, Dolphins. One of two that we were doing in a doubleheader. All right. So, quickly here before we take the next break, as we want to keep this party going. As we want to keep the party going. Quickly here before we take another break. What are my top 5 favorite Christmas movies to watch? Well, you've got Home Alone 1 and 2 at numbers 1 and 2. But I think I want to move Home Alone 2, Lost in New York. I want to put Home Alone 2, Lost in New York up in that number 1 spot, as I think it was just as funny as Home Alone 1. But you never know what's going to happen. So, Home Alone 2, Lost in New York is at number 1. Home Alone number 1, right behind it, stomping for second. You can't forget about the Santa Claus, but the one that sticks out to me is when Tim Allen, the voice of Scott Calvin, aka Santa Claus, has all the questions wondering why he became Santa Claus after the original Santa Claus fell off his roof. So we're talking about the first Santa Claus with Tim Allen as the voice of Scott Calvin, as I said earlier, aka Santa Claus, or rather, for a better term, also known as Santa Claus. And with that, that is in third place. In fourth place, we've got Elf, featuring Buddy the Elf. And of course, we've got stomping for fifth. Not exactly a Christmas movie, but sometimes when I don't want to listen to a Christmas movie, I often think of a childhood movie. And stomping for fifth is Monsters Incorporated, created by Disney and Pixar, and directed by Pete Docter. For those who don't know what Disney and Pixar is, they are animation studios doing excellent work in creating excellent movie products like Moana 2, I should say. Finding Nemo, Toy Story 4, Toy Story 2, you name it. And one of my favorite projects that they've done, besides Cars, I like Cars, but besides that, one of my favorite projects that they've done is The Incredibles. But we'll talk about that more another time. I have a sixth selection, and this falls around Christmas. But you know that movie when you you've ever wondered whatever happens at the North Pole, and is there a way I could travel there? I'm talking about the Polar Express. Probably one of the best movies I've ever watched. Ah, yes, the man with all the questions. I think what really sets me apart from all the movies I just mentioned, the Santa Claus, the two Home Alone movies, Lost in New York at number one, the first Home Alone movie at number two, the Santa Claus at number three. And then, of course, I said Buddy the Elf, or in this case, Elf, is stomping at number four. At number five, we have Monsters Incorporated. And we also have the Polar Express at number six. But I think what sets me apart from all those movies, besides the Polar Express, I think what sets me apart of that is, yes, okay, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, we have one of those classic quotes for me, but which is, "Ah, yes, the man with all the questions," but it's one of the classic quotes for me. But honestly, I think what really sets me apart is when it comes down to that little musical number they do called Soon You Got Hot Chocolate or whatever it was. It's this really interesting scene where actually, you know what? If you haven't seen the film, I'm not going to spoil it for you. So, my top six, I know I said top five, but my top six Christmas movies that I love watching, even if there's one that's not a Christmas movie, which is Monsters Incorporated, they are the Santa Claus, Home Alone 1 and 2. Lost in New York is number one, followed by the first one. Monsters Incorporated coming in at number 5. The Santa Claus coming in at number 3. Elf coming in at number 4. And the Polar Express coming in at number 6. All right, time for another commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk about holiday music and holiday traditions. Who knows? Maybe the same way we did voice messages when they opened up, we will bring that to you once again. Probably Allie's message from October 22nd, 2022. But we'll see where the action takes us. The one thing I will want to let you know before we take the break, we are coming up on our sports conversations. And in the sports conversations, we'll get you ready for the action on this podcast at the time of our recording, as well as after this show hits the air on Friday. And the action in the NFL this holiday season, as the NFL is going on Netflix, but you'll find out what games are going on there in just a matter of moments. Like I said, we might have another voice message playing when we return. But when we return, it's time to talk about holiday traditions. And I'm going to provide you with now my top 6. We're going to go with top 6 because I did that for movies. We're going to go with top 6 favorite Christmas music that I love to listen to during the holiday season. Spoiler alert, one of those songs on the list comes in on the first movie of the Home Alone franchise. Think you have it? Stay tuned.
CNT Radio will never give you up. They will never let you down, nor will they run around or desert you. So join Nick Astley for The Melting Pot every Saturday on CNT Radio. Hang on a minute. He's not Nick Astley. Oh, jings, I've done it wrong. Anyway, just join Nick for The Melting Pot on CNT Radio.
Looking for a good hockey podcast that covers your favorite hockey teams and mine? Check out On the Ice and Behind the Benches, where we chat about our favorite hockey teams from puck drop to the last play of the action. To learn more, follow the On the Ice and Behind the Benches Facebook page. Search On the Ice and Behind the Benches.
Hi, Scott. It's Ali here. I just wanted to mention that I'm really enjoying the show and I'm really enjoying what you're putting together. And I wanted to just say I'm enjoying being a part of it as well. So please keep up the phenomenal work and make sure you guys keep this podcast going because it really suits you well.
Once again, Ali Musa joining in with quite the voice messages. He had one from Halloween. We've heard that early on. That right there was the voice message from October 22nd, 2022. And speaking of which, I have a very special treat for you. I told you there was going to be a featured interview over the course of the program. It is a full-length interview we're going to play for you. And it comes to us from one of my previous encounters with, of course, it has been a long time since we've encountered it, but that's besides the point. We are going to hear my conversation in 2023 with Erica Lindsay Ayala in full throttle throughout the program. But before we get to the featured interview, I want to take some time here to talk about my top 6 favorite holiday music that I love to listen to. Leading things off here as we continue on episode 29 it is our Christmas party season 3 finale, 1 hour season finale of season 3. During the giving season, we like to end just before Christmas. And before we get to Erica, speaking of the giving season, already I've mentioned a couple of songs in previous recordings that we've done. Not for the season, though, that is. Well, okay, maybe I did it in a few episodes' time, but I've done that a lot on some of our bonus content that we've done. So I'm going to provide you now with my top five, and they might have changed since I mentioned those to you. So just in case, one of my top favorites in the top number one is Mary's Boy Child. A really nice song, and definitely for those of us who are Christian, of course, if you're not Christian, it doesn't really matter because we all are equal here on Sports for Beginners, and I don't want to discourage anyone, regardless of where you come from, what language you speak. It doesn't matter to me because we're all equal, and that's what I'll leave that there with. Coming in at number two, oh, I really like this one. Give it up for Chuck Berry's Run, Run, Rudolph. Now, for those who aren't familiar, this is a song from the first Home Alone film, and it takes place. I'm pretty sure by now we've all seen the Home Alone franchise, but I'm not going to spoil too much. I just will say this happens basically, this song happens to come on just before the parents of Kevin McAllister find out they have left him behind by accident. And basically, during this time, they are trying to make their flight to Paris, which is where the first film is set in. Well, actually, it's set in Chicago, where the McAllister family lives. But that's all I'm going to bring up for you right now. All right, moving on. We have Mary's Boy Child. We have Run Run Rudolph in at second. Coming in at number three, it's Paul McCartney's Wonderful Christmas Time. This is a song that I really enjoy listening to. And although I don't necessarily have a good enough reason, I'm pretty sure there are a couple of us who really like this music. For me, I just like the beat that it has to it. It's a really catchy beat, and I really enjoy listening to it. At number four, we have All I Want for Christmas Is You by Mariah Carey. And to those who I have mentioned, if you're listening to this now or you're making this part of your Friday, thank you so much for joining us. And all credit if we were going to play audio, which unfortunately we're not going to do so because I don't have the credit. But all credit to Mariah Carey, Chuck Berry, and those behind Mary's Boy Child. Coming in at number four, it's Waltz of the Flowers from Koboski. If I pronounce the guy wrong, I apologize, but it's Waltz of the Flowers that's coming in at number four for my favorite Christmas music, which is Joyful and Triumphant. Joyful and Triumphant, I should say. It said dreadful there, but I wanted to say joyful and triumphant. And Waltz of the Flowers is really, it's a really nice song. It's a really, really good, it's a really, really good song. Yes, it's not necessarily lyric verse, because it's actually a piece. It's a music piece. But that's the thing about music. It tries to tell a story. It tries to tell us a story as you listen to it. So Waltz of the Flowers is coming in at number 4. And coming in at number 5, we've got DJ Play a Christmas Song by Cher. I don't know what it is, but I've somehow become attached to that song. All right. Before I reveal number 6 on my top 6 Christmas songs list, let us get to our featured interview that you can find, and I'll provide a link to the video in our YouTube, which is on our YouTube channel. I'll provide a link to the video. But let's get to our featured interview and my conversation with Erica Lindsay Ayala. So here is my conversation with Erica. And by the way, for those who don't know, Erica is the host of the bi-weekly segment on Locked On NHL, Women's Hockey Spotlight. She also is the only host of Locked On Kraken, the daily centric Kraken podcast surrounding the NHL's Seattle Kraken. Erica does beautiful. She does a wonderful job covering the Kraken and the Coachella Valley Firebirds, as well as the PWHL. And for those who may not be aware, if you watch the video, she was wearing a WNBA shirt at the time of our recording. With that said, here's my conversation with Erica as part of one of our season episodes, and I believe it was during season 2, but double check that to make sure, just in case. With that, here's my conversation with Erica as she made her debut on one of the seasons, not in season 3 though. And here's your featured interview. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Sports for Beginners podcast studio. My name is Scott McGregor, and I am your host of this program. And I am also the co-host of the combined podcast on the All Over the Map podcast called Sports Reactions. However, like I've mentioned in recent shows, Sports Reactions was discontinued, so we will not be doing any more of those shows on All Over the Map, but stay tuned for updates on that. Joining me today in the studio is the host of the Daily Centric podcast for the Seattle Kraken, and that is also a host of the Locked On NHL podcast's every other Friday segment called the Women's Hockey Spotlight, available on the Locked On Podcast Network, which is, as it's always mentioned in its tagline, your team every day. We are joined by the one and only Erica Lindsay Ayala. And Erica, as I've just mentioned, is the host of Locked On Kraken and the host of the every other Friday program on the Locked On NHL podcast, Women's Hockey Spotlight. Ladies and gentlemen, with this all being said, please welcome to the program today your host of Locked On Kraken and Locked On NHL's Women's Hockey Spotlight, Erica Lindsay Ayala. Erica, how are you doing today? I wanted to take this opportunity to welcome you to the program. How are you doing
Thank
today?
you. Yeah, well, I'm excited to be here with you, Scott. I appreciate you reaching out and for giving me such a gracious introduction. But I'm doing okay today. I am back in my hometown of New York, so I'm on the road. I don't live in New York anymore these days, but it's nice to be back in New York, and it's nice to be able to talk some hockey with you today.
All right. So with that being said, before we get into the main topics, talking Dave Haxtell, we'll talk a little mental health, and of course, we'll get a women's hockey spotlight sort of perspective on the great game of hockey. Before we get started, though, could you please tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what it has been like to cover the Seattle Kraken on the Locked On Podcast Network?
Well, sure thing. I guess I kind of gave a little teaser there, but I grew up in New York. I'm the eldest daughter of three girls, growing up here in New York City and the surrounding areas. I played a lot of sports growing up. Baseball was and probably still is my main passion. I started playing baseball, t-ball, and then that evolved into other sports, with the exception of hockey, as fate would have it. But yeah, so I grew up playing sports, have always been around sports, and played softball in college at Elon University. And then I went to work in the nonprofit sector, working at a lot of different child advocacy organizations. And basically what that means, or at least the work that I did there, is working alongside families, children and families, and organizations that serve children and families. So healthcare providers, schools, community centers, etc., and creating good policy to be beneficial to parents and families. And the work I specifically did was to be the liaison. So you have policy writers who kind of do that more often than not in a vacuum, or at least they're always talking. In New York State, Albany is our capital, so they're talking to officials, elected officials. But my role was to take what we were doing as an organization with elected officials and make it accessible to the people who would benefit hopefully from the programs that we were advocating for. And anyway, so the way that I got to covering the Kraken is that I had started right around the time that the National Women's Hockey League started. They had a team in New York. And long story short, my sister and I, one of my sisters, Jessie, we were going to the Riveters games in Brooklyn. And I'm a pretty curious person. I started learning who was writing about the league and the teams and the players. And that led to opportunities to come on podcasts like what we're doing right now, and eventually led to an opportunity for me to write more regularly about the league. And then the league actually tapped me to be a broadcaster by the second season. So things moved pretty fast. But flash forward, after covering my first year of hockey, women's hockey, I then covered other sports, including, for those maybe watching on video, I'm wearing a WNBA shirt. And I then started with the Locked On organization through a mutual colleague that was covering WNBA, and I was actually a host of Locked On Women's Basketball, which, as you mentioned, our motto is your team every day, but we would have multiple hosts. And so I had 2 of the 5 days where I was talking WNBA. And around that time, I got a message from the coordinator for the NHL side of things, because the Locked On Network knew that I was covering women's hockey, and they had some openings for NHL hosts and wanted to know if I would host a show. And at the time, the teams that they had available, I didn't know much about those teams. Again, I never played hockey. I was not covering NHL hockey at the time, but I had been tapped to write a few stories for, at the time, NHL Seattle. They were not the Seattle Kraken yet, but I wrote a story on Willie O'Ree about for NHL Seattle, and then eventually NHL Seattle tapped me to be one of their writers for their website for the launch of the name and the branding. And so once I did that, I got to learn a little bit more about now the Seattle Kraken. I liked what they were doing from an organizational perspective, and that they gave me the freedom to write about women's hockey for them. I wrote about, again, Willie O'Ree for them. I wrote about the Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes in Nova Scotia. And I wanted to dabble a little bit more in hockey. And so I said to the Locked On Network, well, I'm not necessarily interested in any of these shows, but when you're ready to launch the Kraken show, let me know. And I listed a lot of the credentials I just told you, and the rest is history. I was the first and have been the only host of Locked On Kraken.
Yes, yes. And for those who don't know, unless you've been listening to Locked On Kraken every day, again, that's your team every day on the Locked On Podcast Network. Erica actually was starting the show amid the first season of Seattle Kraken hockey. So
Right.
since then, she has also been in news with the Coachella Firebirds, Coachella Valley Firebirds, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
And that brings us pretty much through our second and our third question. So we're going to move on to talking about to our fourth question, and that is, first of all, I want to talk about, actually, we may go back to our third question, but we're going to go to the fourth question right now.
Okay.
And the fourth question I had for you is, I understand that you also cover the women's version of the great game of hockey. So could you please tell us how the idea of a segment based on women's hockey on the Locked On NHL podcast every other Friday came up? And can you please give me some examples, if it's all right with you, please?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. As I mentioned, Scott, I started with the Locked On Network covering women's sports on the women's basketball side. So I knew that whether it was Locked On NHL, which covers an entire league, or even Locked On Women's Basketball, which covers multiple leagues and internationally, that there was a model where we could cover not just a specific team, but kind of maybe we call it a genre or a topic of sport. And so pretty early on, since I have been covering Locked On, and Scott, I'm so grateful that you are an everyday listener and OGer. But you know that I've been sprinkling in history, women's hockey history, in my coverage, including working with the amazing organization Women's Pro Hockey to Seattle. And one of our very first episodes was walking through the history of hockey in the Pacific Northwest with Zoe, who is an amazing historian, but also in that history, making sure that we included women's hockey history. And it's always been something that I've done on Locked On Kraken. And as I know you know, I mention a lot that my references for hockey come from the women's game. I've covered the Olympics. Well, technically, I also covered the men's side, but I covered primarily the women's game at the Olympics, at World Championships, at Frozen Fours, and I've done men's Frozen Four as well now, mostly for the Olympics and the Frozen Four for Maddie Beniers through Locked On Kraken. But I don't ever, I remember, let me put it this way. I remember when I was asked to speak about being tapped as the host for Locked On Kraken, someone said to me something akin to, oh, well, this must be a step up for you because now you're covering men's hockey. And I understand where that sentiment comes from. But again, I came to the Locked On Kraken show already having covered Olympians and interviewing Olympians and going to national and international tournaments. So I don't see it for me as a step up per se. I see it, if anything, as just expanding my hockey coverage. And so that's always been my philosophy. So early on, when I became a part of the Locked On NHL, kind of subsect of the Locked On Podcast Network, I wanted to see if we could get something similar to Locked On Women's Basketball for the hockey side. At the time, we had the league that I mentioned, the National Women's Hockey League, rebranded to the Premier Hockey Federation. The Premier Hockey Federation, as we're talking, has been acquired, but I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit. But I really felt that between just coming off an Olympics, again, I was at Beijing and covered that game and have had commissioners and all kinds of people. Jessica Campbell, you mentioned the Coachella Valley Firebirds, that we see so much influx of the women's game into at the NHL level in a broader way than we've seen in years past. And so it just felt like time. So ultimately, the compromise that we have made is to have a segment every other Friday to try and get up a listenership. And that would not have been my first choice, but I also understand the economics, or I should say, I understand people's concerns surrounding the economics, but it's been a lot of fun. And I have had Commissioner Reagan Carey of the aforementioned Premier Hockey Federation on the show. We've had Liz Knox from the PWHPA. We have had a bunch of other people, and it's been exciting. And so I'm really looking forward to continuing to grow the viewership and listenership for the Women's Hockey Spotlight. And for those who are familiar with the Locked On Network, we have 3 segments. So it's really anywhere from 8 to 12 minutes in one show, in a 30-minute show where we're talking about hockey, women's hockey. And it's not everything that I want. I would at minimum like an entire day dedicated to women's hockey, if not an entire show. But baby steps, we'll start there.
Yeah, baby steps, baby steps, baby steps. So that brings me back to the Kraken for a second. So obviously the Kraken had made some history last season, but before we get to that question, I want to ask you, could you tell us who stood out to you this past season, and do you see them returning to the team?
Sure. Well, there are some players that stood out that are no longer with the team, so I guess I'll just start there. I think that Daniel Sprong, he came in on a PTO after coming to the Seattle Kraken at the trade deadline, and that was a big story. And as far as some of our fourth liners or players that again have moved on, Daniel Sprong, as of the time we're talking, Scott, has signed with the Detroit Red Wings, but he definitely stood out. And in the last handful of shows, I've been talking about how the Kraken are going to have to, especially for their bottom 6 forwards, are going to have to figure out how to recreate and replicate some of his productivity, especially offensively. Another player that I will be honest, and listeners know, I was a little bit on the fence about, but that was Morgan Geekie. I think when it comes to being a player that we could plug and play, not just as a centerman, as other players kind of moved around, including Yanni Gourde, who we know who can play the wing and has played center, and or other players like Ryan Donato, who's one of my absolute favorites and is also gone and has gone to Chicago. But so those are some of the players that definitely stepped up. But again,
all right. So when we get down to it, I do want to. We're actually going to get this out of the way just to get it out there. So, with the changes happening all around the NHL, I'm curious about your thoughts on the Dave Hakstol extension. So, when Dave Hakstol was extended as the coach of the Kraken, what was going through your mind when you first heard the Kraken say that we have extended head coach Dave Hakstol?
I thought it was a good move. And again, going back to some of the players that I just mentioned who are not with the team but made big strides, that's a part of Dave Hakstol building a very strong culture. That also is reinforced with Ron Francis, our general manager, who was also extended, mind you, coming out of our playoff run. But, the Seattle Kraken are building a very strong culture. Dave Hakstol got a lot of heat that I thought was at times unwarranted in season one, where the Seattle Kraken did not have a great season, and then all of a sudden things changed. But what I liked is that, you know, he was able to really build a strong culture to the point where other players, to answer your other question a little bit more thoroughly, you know, players like Vince Dunn, who we were able to avoid arbitration with and has been extended, who had a great season, he talked about wanting to come back and wanting to, even outside of the most recent extension, play for Seattle for several years to come. You even hear veteran players like Jaden Schwartz and Jordan Eberle saying those kinds of things, or Jared McCann, who we also extended in the middle of our first season, saying things like that. And I do think that Dave Haxtell is an integral part of the culture that we're building with the Seattle Kraken. So I thought it was great to extend him.
Yes, and you mentioned Jared McCann, and for those who may not know, Jared McCann was also a member of the Pittsburgh Penguins, and he did come over to Seattle. Not exactly sure how that happened, but he did leave Pittsburgh before coming to the Kraken. So you can look that up just to make sure I'm getting that correct, but I do know that Jared is no longer a Penguin.
Yes, and I can fill in the holes there. So Jared McCann, as you mentioned, yes, representing the Steel City there, but was actually, I believe, was traded to Toronto. Never actually played for Toronto, but then was exposed in the expansion draft. And so that is how Jared McCann in the expansion draft, which I was able to cover for Locked On Kraken, one of our first events for the show, that's how he ends up in Seattle. And it's funny that you mentioned Jared McCann. You know, a lot of players, Vince Dunn and Eberle and so many, Yanni Gourde, are players who obviously were exposed in the expansion draft, but what they've said is that, and what a lot of them, even Andre Burakovsky, who we picked up last free agency, these are players who were not necessarily the player on their former teams, but they were role players. And so the opportunity to come to Seattle and show that they can be a go-to guy in the NHL was a part of the reason, especially for those who come over in free agency, why they wanted to come to Seattle. And then another thing that they talk about, speaking of Dave Haxtell, is how it's a team by committee. And so everyone has an opportunity to contribute. And again, that comes for me from Dave Haxtell.
All right, we're going to take a break. Indeed. All right. And on that note, as we take this break, I invite you to check out the link in the description for more from Erica, myself, in our featured interview. I know I said I was going to do it full length, but we're already about an hour into the program, so I do want to make sure we make some time for the sports conversation, including what's coming up on Sports for Beginners. We're going to take a break, and this is our final break of the program. When we return, I'll open the floor. We don't have time for holiday traditions. The timing, especially when I kind of repeated myself, which I apologize for when we were taking our last break. The timing of that kind of threw things off, but that's okay. Link in the description of the episode for Erica joining the show. She joined the show when we were doing our 27th episode in season 2 of the program. And that was her debut episode on the program. I will have a link to that episode and the video as well in the description of the episode so that you can watch it in full force. And with that said, now that we're going to take a break, when we return, the program will wrap up with, unfortunately, unable to do holiday traditions, but it will wrap up with a little sports talk, particularly my takes on the Penguins so far this season. I do want to talk a little Utah Hockey Club, and I also want to talk some Bills, but we don't really have a lot of time to do the Bills, so we're just going to go Utah Hockey Club and Pittsburgh Penguins. But to all our Bills fans out there, Bills post-game as we wrap up Season 3 of the program will continue, same for the Penguins post-game show as well. And I invite you to join us for the remaining regular season content, Bills post-game, continuing into the postseason as the Bills are in the postseason. More on that and all that stuff, including what's coming up during Christmas in the NFL when we return to Sports for Beginners, episode 29, our 1 hour Season 3 Christmas party finale wraps up with some sports conversations right after this. Stick with us.
Take another look with Gerda Felix and Melanie Taddeo Malo, two powerful women of diverse backgrounds having genuine, unique, and uncomfortable conversations that everyone needs to have. Join Melanie and Gerda for conversations about what is missing from human connections.
Looking for a sports podcast that covers sports weekly as well as gets you set up for the day? Check out Weekly in Sports with me, Scott McGregor. We give some shout-outs of the week to podcasts like this one and those who do them. Discuss the Blue Jays, Bills, Raptors, and more. To learn more, check out the Sports for Beginners Facebook page. Search Sports for Beginners.
Looking for conversations on the world of broadcasting, sports media, and from time to time, my favorite sports teams? Listen to Broadcast Map with me, Ali Musa. To learn more about the show and to view the upcoming schedule, like the Broadcast Map Facebook page. Search Broadcast Map.
Welcome back to the 29th episode and 1 hour season 3 finale, Christmas party finale on Sports for Beginners. My name is Scott McGregor. Thank you guys so much for being here with us. Hope we are making your Christmas special or your Hanukkah special. I did want to do holiday traditions, but we don't have time to do that. We kind of overtook it in the last break before the break we just took moments ago with me repeating stuff. So I'm going to try to limit that as much as I can in season 4. Speaking of that, you're going to find out in just a few moments when that will possibly be back and that actually will begin. But January is our start time for the new era of a Weekly in Sports podcast that will be happening next year. The podcast era of Weekly in Sports will be born in January 2025. And I might have an anniversary of it coming up in the second running of Weekly in Sports in January 2026. We'll see. As that show embarks on its second year as a podcast, it's become a combined podcast for the last couple of days and last couple of months or years since we began. So we will celebrate that probably in January 2026. But the era begins in 2025. Early on, you've heard a little bit of my conversation from episode 27 of season 2 as our featured interview with the one and only Erica Lindsay Ayala. If you want to hear the rest of the program, go to the full episode in the link down in the description. Or if you're on YouTube, let's say you're listening to the audio version of this, you want to listen to the video side of it, head on over to our playlist on YouTube, Sports for Beginners podcast interviews, and click on the one with Erica and myself. It was a really nice conversation, really great conversation, rather. Looking forward to having another conversation like that sometime in season 4 of this podcast. Perhaps we'll talk PWHL. Definitely going to talk Kraken. And we're talking about perhaps WNBA. Speaking of which, before this month even began, there was some news about Toronto getting a new WNBA team. And that's where the conversation's going to start in sports world. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to Canada's WNBA team getting started with battle in 2026. In 2026. That is tip-off for the inaugural season of Canada's WNBA team called wait for it, the Toronto Tempo. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Canada's team of the WNBA is the Toronto Tempo. And everyone has their opinion on this team. I think it's a great name. We're going to have to see what happens in 2026 when they tip off. But I'll be keeping a close eye on the Tempo in the WNBA. And as someone that doesn't watch a lot of WNBA, now that we have a team here in Canada, I will be tuning in to the WNBA as best I can to keep an eye on the Toronto Tempo. It looks like a really nice name. The logo reminds me a bit of the Calgary Flames logo of the NHL, even though the colors aren't exactly the same as the Calgary Flames. If you want more information on that, you can go to their Instagram page or elsewhere in their social medias, but I prefer their Instagram page. And if you want the latest on the tempo, I recommend checking out the podcast Bringing Home the W. It's one of the newest podcasts I've decided to check out since I've shown interest now for the WNBA. And Bringing Home the W is a podcast hosted by Tanya K.G. with co-host Josh McConnell as they follow the journey of not just any sports team, but Canada's first WNBA team. If you haven't already checked it out on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts, and maybe on YouTube. I don't know if it's on YouTube yet, but it's definitely on Spotify. I highly recommend for WNBA fans that are going to become fans of the Toronto Tempo. I highly recommend you go check that out. I highly recommend it. It's a really great program. I myself enjoy it. And I really enjoy what Tanya's putting together. So once again, that's the WNBA Toronto podcast, Bringing Home the W. Once again, that's Bringing Home the W, hosted by Tanya K.G. And Tanya, if I pronounce your last name wrong, or got the first letter of... Oh, yes, I did. I got the first letter of the last name a bit wrong there. I should have said C.G. That's what it says. There we go. So Tanya, if I was going to pronounce the last name wrong, I want to make sure I get the first letter of the last name right. The first two letters of the last name right. Those are C.G., not K.G. Just to make that clear. And with that being said, moving from the WNBA to my thoughts on the Minnesota Frost so far this season in the EWHL. That season got started on Saturday. And so far I like what I'm seeing from the Minnesota Frost. A bit of a questionable year to kick it off after you raised your banner. But I do like what I'm seeing from Minnesota Frost this year. Do I think they can hit Pater and repeat as Walter Cup champions? We'll see. I think they can still do that. I think they can still do it. But we're in a 30-game season. When you look at it, every team in the league is playing 30 games this season. So a total, I believe that's 90 games happening in this season. It's the second season of the PWHL. And as I mentioned earlier on, it started in November, at the end of November. And last year, in 2024, in the inaugural season, they started in January, which, wouldn't you know it, is coming up soon. It's next month. January is next month. All right. Well, with that being said, the Minnesota Frost, I feel like they're playing okay, but they were off to a bit of a bumpy start with a loss from the New York Sirens, who they will play on Sunday, December 22nd, 2024 at 12 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Central. But of course, our action will return on Thursday when the Frost take on the Charge at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central. 3 games played, the Minnesota Frost have lost once in overtime. They've picked up a W twice, defeating Toronto and Boston. And they currently sit top dogs in the standings, with New York stomping for second. Montreal is third. Ottawa is fourth. Toronto is fifth. And Boston is sixth. All right. Quick thoughts here on Buffalo. Well, Bills fans, I gotta tell you, I really like what the Bills are putting together. It was great to see the return of Micah Hyde to the team. Now, we have yet to see Micah Hyde in a matchup, but as I am aware, when he signed with the team to return to the team, he is on a practice squad role. So unless he gets elevated from the practice squad, Micah Hyde is still a practice squad member for the team, for the Buffalo Bills. Buffalo Bills play division matchups over the course of our hiatus for season 3 as we transition to season 4 of Sports for Beginners, as they'll play the Patriots twice, and in between matchups against the Patriots, they will take on the Jets for the final time this season. Both the first Patriot game and the final Jets game down at Highmark Stadium, before the Bills head on to Foxborough to take on the Patriots in their Week 18 finale on my birthday, January the 5th, 2025. And that's a busy day when it comes to the Bills and the Pittsburgh Penguins. So, we'll see what we can bring to you on that day. With that being said, speaking of the Penguins, given where the Penguins are at right now, Penguins fans, I'm not losing hope right now on the Penguins, regardless on how they play. They've got a matchup against the Kings tomorrow as we are speaking to you on Monday, December 16th, 2024. This show will drop on Friday, December 20th, 2024. So by the time you hear this, the game against the Kings, as well as the games against the Predators and possibly the Devils game will be final, but definitely the Predators and the Kings game will be final by the time you listen to this. And the Kings are playing the Penguins at 7 o'clock tomorrow night, as we talked to you on Monday. They are going to play Nashville on Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Eastern, excuse me. 7 p.m. Central. So when it comes to that, I'm pretty much going to be a busy bee on Thursday. Getting ready for a Penguin post-game show, as well as a PWHL post-game show on PWHL Recap. Kind of like a triple trouble when you consider that this show is being recorded today and dropping on Friday. And then, of course, you've got the Penguins game on Thursday night, followed by, or rather after, the Frost game against the Charge on Thursday night. You've got those ones dropping on, you've got those post-game shows dropping Friday as well. Those might drop on Saturday. Regardless, back to the action with Buffalo and the PWHL on Sunday. But with that said, we have just about reached the end of the program. So very quickly here, what can we expect this Christmas? Well, if you're an NFL fan, prepare yourself, because with week 16 starting this week, as we record here, we just found out about a time change. Let's jump to that, shall we? A kickoff time change has changed for that week 16 game as we talk about it. We have a time change for this week's game against the Patriots. What's our time change for the Patriots game? What's the time change? Here we go. We have a time change here. The Patriots game will be played at 4:25 p.m. Eastern Time. So, a time change there. We're going to find out, I'm sure, more about that as we can. But that was something I didn't expect to see on this recording. So yes, note the start time again. 4:25 p.m. Eastern Time. Patriots and Bills. So it looks like Sunday you're going to get a post-game show and a pre-game show. 2 for the price of 1. All right. Anywho, on December 25th, we've got quite the action on the gridiron for you. The Kansas City Chiefs take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. At 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Christmas afternoon. Later in the afternoon at 4:30, the Baltimore Ravens are in Houston to take on the Texans. That is our Christmas lineup on week 17. That's 1 week from this week. Games starting Wednesday. Then Thursday night football. The day after Boxing Day. No, actually, I should say on Boxing Day, I should say. Seahawks taking on the Bears in the bright lights. Sunday Night Football features the Dolphins and the Browns. And we've got not a packed Sunday in week 17. Only a few 1 o'clock games and one 4:25 game. But the games to be determined for that week are Denver in Cincinnati, Arizona at the Rams, Indianapolis against the Giants, Patriots against the Chargers, and Falcons at the Commanders. So those are games that are going to be determined. The one thing we do know is that the Bills will play at 1 o'clock, but that can change. So we're going to find out a lot about what's going on in these next 2 weeks of football. Meanwhile, the NBA, do we have any classic holiday action on the 25th? Yes, we do. We've got afternoon basketball. Spurs and the Knicks at 12 p.m. At 2:30, the Wolves visit the Mavericks at 2:30 p.m. Then at 5 o'clock, at 5 p.m. to the exact, we've got the Sixers taking on the Celtics. The Lakers take on the Warriors, and the Nuggets are in Phoenix to take on the Suns. All right. Just about an hour into now 2 hours of the show, so we're going to wrap it up here. Check your local listenings for the games. The games on December 25th for the NFL. They will be available on Netflix, but check your local listenings to see if you can get the game on TSN in Canada or any other station. But those games, Texans, Ravens, Chiefs, Steelers on Christmas Day, December 25th, are on Netflix. And speaking of Netflix, if you're a WWE fan, boy, does Netflix have a treat for you starting in 2025. You like Monday Night Raw, you like Friday Night SmackDown, you like NXT, and you certainly love all those events that you can't really get on TV, especially on Sportsnet, if you have to pay for it by pay-per-view, or if you have to subscribe to WWE Network. Guess what? Netflix has you covered. Starting in 2025, you'll be able to listen to NXT, Monday Night Raw, and Friday Night SmackDown, as well as the premium live events, including the 2025 Royal Rumble, which kickstarts the road to WrestleMania. So if I were you, unless you have Netflix, I'd get right on into getting Netflix right now if I'm a WWE fan. All right, I've kept you long enough. We are about 2 hours in, I believe. I mean, technically we're about an hour, 51 minutes in, but I've kept you long enough. Time for us to close out the show here. So, I just want to say very much thank you guys so much for joining us here today on the podcast. I know we've had the show longer than expected, but that's going to happen sometimes. So, with that being said, thank you so much for joining us here today on the podcast. Would love it, even if you haven't stayed with us all episode long. I would love it if you took a second to rate and review and share the podcast. If you're on YouTube, click like if you like what you're hearing. Click the like button if you like what you're hearing. If you like what you're hearing, I should say. Click subscribe if you really like it. Tell all of your friends. That is it for season 3 of Sports for Beginners, and I am your host, Scott McGregor. We'll be back in the new year for season 4 of Sports for Beginners. Likely late February or early March, or rather mid-March. Probably mid-March will be when we begin. But until then, our coverage of Bills football, Penguins hockey, and PWHL hockey coverage as our bonus content coverage, as well as our coverage of Dolphins football continues. Season 3 is in the books in Sports for Beginners. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Hope to see you again next season in our season 4. But understand if you are not in it to check it out. If you're new to the program, I highly recommend starting at season 1, or just pick an episode and start there. As we always remind you, love one another, be kind to yourself, be kind to one another, have a blessed and joyous Christmas. Wishing you all a happy New Year and a blessed Christmas. And for all of you who celebrate Hanukkah, I want to wish you all a happy Hanukkah. For those who celebrate Christmas, I wish you all a very blessed Christmas and a happy New Year. And anyone else who celebrates any other holiday, all I want to say to you is happy holidays from all of us here at Sports for Beginners. Season 3 has ended. On to Season 4 in the new year. And a new era of Weekly in Sports begins in 2025. Same as Season 4 begins in 2025. Not as quickly as Weekly in Sports' new era begins. What do you want us to cover on the podcast? Leave us a comment with your feedback in YouTube, on Discord, or on Spotify, or however your favorite podcatcher works. What do you want us to cover? The floor is open to you now. And as Kelly McDonald would say, on a Friday, the door is open to you. Get on out of here, will you? Happy holidays, everybody. We will see you in the new year, but our bonus coverage continues even with Season 3 in the book.